Hello everyone, Ravi here. Now we are going to listen to podcast news. It includes national news and editorials. While walking in the morning or evening, while cooking, cycling or during free time you can listen. Listening improves the quality of communication and comprehension. Before going ahead, I would like to welcome you all to the virtual school. A new way of learning and teaching, with the vision of let's grow together. Our mission is to learn how to learn and teach how to teach. So stay tuned. And here we go. 20th May 2021. Front page. 26 bodies recovered from barge of Mumbai. 49 remain missing. Modi conducts aerial survey of cyclone hit areas in Gujarat. Announces ex gratia. Harrowing ordeal. People rescued by the Navy walking out of INS Kochi in Mumbai on Wednesday. Emmanuel Yogini. Dinakar Peri, New Delhi. 26 bodies have been recovered and 49 are still missing from barge P-305 which sunk 35 nautical miles (nm) off the Mumbai coast due to cyclone Taki. As of now, 186 crew members of accommodation barge P-305 and 2 from tug, Varaprada, have been rescued by naval ships and aircraft, a Navy spokesperson said on Wednesday. INS Kochi, which entered the Mumbai harbour in the day to disembark 125 survivors and mortal remains of 4 crew members, was immediately sailed out in the evening again to continue the search effort, the spokesperson said. INS Kolkata is scheduled to enter the Mumbai harbour to disembark the survivors rescued from barge P-305 and Varaprada, as well as the mortal remains of 18 crew members, he added. The names of those rescued have been conveyed to the Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, ONGC, and AFCONS. Naval ships Insteg, Bitwa, V's, P-8I aircraft and seeking helicopters are continuing with the search and rescue operations. 3 construction barges of AFCONS, working on a project of the ONGC, and 1 drilling rig of the ONGC deployed for exploration purpose in Bombay high off the coast of Mumbai, were impacted by Cyclone Taki, which hit the Arabian Sea off the coast of Mumbai on May 17. Assistance for Gujarat. The cyclone, which made landfall between Diu and Una town of Gir Somnath district in Gujarat on Monday night after barreling along the west coast, left a trail of devastation. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who conducted an aerial survey of areas hit by the cyclone in Gujarat, on Wednesday approved an assistance of 1,000 rupees crore for immediate relief activities in the state, a release said. According to the Gujarat government, 46 persons lost their lives in cyclone-related incidents in the state. The Nationalist Congress Party and the Shiv Sena have criticized Mr. Modi for not conducting the aerial survey in Maharashtra, also hit by the cyclone. Mr. Modi announced an ex gratia of 2 rupees lakh for the kin of those killed due to the cyclone in all affected states. Immediate financial assistance for the other affected states would be given after the respective state governments shared assessment of the damage with the centre, a Press Information Bureau release said. COVID-19 affected should defer shots by 3 months. Ministry recommends vaccination for nursing mothers. Battle continues, a health worker administering vaccine to a youth in Bhopal on Wednesday. A.M. Faruqi. Special Correspondent, New Delhi. Vaccination should be deferred by 3 months after recovery in individuals having lab test proven SARS-2 COVID-19 illness, said the Health Ministry in a statement issued on Wednesday. COVID-19 patients who have been given anti-SARS-CoV-2 monoclonal antibodies or convalescent plasma should also defer vaccination by 3 months from the date of discharge from the hospital. The ministry also recommended COVID-19 vaccination for all nursing mothers. The ministry said it had accepted the recommendations of the National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration for COVID-19, NEGVAC. These recommendations have been based on the evolving situation of the COVID-19 pandemic and emerging global scientific evidence and experience, it stated. It recommended that individuals who have received at least the first dose of the vaccine and got the infection before the completion of the dosing schedule should also defer by 3 months the second dose after clinical recovery from COVID-19. Blood donation. Persons with any other serious general illness requiring hospitalization or ICU care should also wait for 4 to 8 weeks before getting the COVID-19 vaccine, it noted. Also, an individual could donate blood after 14 days of either receipt of COVID-19 vaccine or testing RT-PCR negative, if suffering from COVID-19. There was no requirement for screening of the vaccine recipients by rapid antigen test, RAT, prior to vaccination. The matter of vaccination of pregnant women was under discussion and further deliberation by the National Technical Advisory Group on Immunization, NTAGI. The Health Ministry has written to states and UTs to direct the concerned officials to take note of these recommendations and undertake necessary action for their effective implementation. States have also been advised to undertake training of the vaccination staff at all levels, said the release. Delhi CM not speaking for India, Jaishankar row over remark on Singapore variant. S. Jaishankar. Kallol Bhattacharya. Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal does not speak for India, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar declared on Wednesday after Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan objected to Mr. Kejriwal's claim that a highly infectious variant of COVID-19 affecting children came from Singapore. High Commissioner of Singapore Simon Wan praised the Indian response but maintained that Singapore reserves the right to implement the country's online misinformation law relating to assertions from Mr. Kejriwal. Mr. Jaishankar's comment came after Singapore summoned the Indian envoy to protest Mr. Kejriwal's remarks. Scrap new privacy policy, Centre tells WhatsApp Gov seeks response from firm in 7 days. Yuthika Bhargava, New Delhi. The Government of India has sent a notice to WhatsApp asking it to withdraw the controversial update to its privacy policy and sought a response from the company within 7 days. It has also warned the Facebook-owned firm that the failure to give a satisfactory response may result in steps in consonance with law. The Ministry of Electronics and IT, May21, in the May 18 notice, has told WhatsApp that deferring the May 15 implementation deadline does not absolve it from respecting the values of informational privacy, data security and user choice for Indian users, a ministry source said. The ministry highlighted how the new policy violated several provisions of Indian laws, the source said. When contacted, a WhatsApp spokesperson said, "We reaffirmed what we said before that this update does not impact the privacy of personal messages for anyone." The May21 notice directs WhatsApp to withdraw its privacy policy 2021 as the changes and the manner of introducing these changes undermine the sacrosanct values of informational privacy, data security and user choice for Indian users and harms the rights and interests of Indian citizens. In fulfillment of its sovereign responsibility to protect the rights and interests of Indian citizens, the Government of India will consider various options available to it under laws in India. The government has given 7 days time to WhatsApp to respond to his notice, and if no satisfactory response is received, necessary steps in consonance with law will be taken, the source said. The government had earlier this year also written to Will Cathcart, CEO of the instant messaging firm, asking that proposed changes to the privacy policy be withdrawn, expressing grave concerns over the implications of the choice and the autonomy of Indian citizens. In the latest missive to the US-headquartered firm, May21 has reiterated the issue of discriminatory treatment of Indian users. Politicians, bureaucrats find it difficult to accept failure. HC Court expresses concern over risks faced by District Court judicial officers. Staff reporter, New Delhi. The Delhi High Court on Wednesday said politicians and bureaucrats find it very difficult to accept their failure and inability as it is not in their veins, while expressing concerns over the condition of District Court's judicial officers who are at risk of contracting COVID-19 owing to the nature of duties. A bench of Justice Vipin Sanghi and Justice Jasmeet Singh said that 3 judicial officers have already died after contracting the virus in the capital. The bench asked the government whether the judicial officers in the subordinate courts could be treated akin to frontline workers. In Supreme Court and High Court, we hold constitutional positions. Our protocols are different, but that is not the case of subordinate judiciary. You should take steps for good reason. We don't have to trust. If administration is satisfied that judicial officers are discharging frontline duties, you can record in your order and provide facilities, the High Court told the city government. The court was hearing a plea filed by the Delhi Judicial Officers Association with respect to the health facilities in view of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Facilities and eyewash. Senior advocate Daya Krishnan, representing the association, said that the facilities on ground for judicial officers are an eyewash. The association asked for creation of a district-wise attachment of hospitals for judicial officers and appointment of a centralized nodal officer to assist the judicial officer when help is sought. The association said that 852 judicial officers and staff have already been infected with the virus. During the hearing, Delhi Government Standing Counsel Santosh Kumar Tripathi submitted the facilities for judicial officers have been put in place as per the court's direction. To this, the bench reacted, that has not delivered. They are here because it didn't bring about any satisfactory results. It is very difficult for bureaucracy and political leaders to accept their failure or inability. Frontline workers. The High Court has ordered the Delhi government to come up with a status report on the issue by May 26, the next date of hearing. The court also noted the submissions of senior advocate Rahul Mehra, representing Delhi government, that the government will decide on declaring judicial officers as frontline workers. Mr. Mehra also said that the association may also submit their representation to the Delhi Chief Secretary. Thank you. Editorial 1. Flashing lights as inflation threatens economy's consumptive capacity, cash transfers can boost demand. The RBI's latest monthly bulletin has just confirmed what many economists and anecdotal evidence have been pointing to, a sharp backslide in economic momentum. In an article on the state of the economy, RBI officials including Deputy Governor Michael Debabrata Pakra have flagged the demand shock inflicted by the ferocious second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, they have cited the loss of mobility, impact on discretionary spending and increase in unemployment as clear signs that demand is in the doldrums. Several high-frequency indicators for April have captured the reversal in momentum. GST e-way bills, an indicator of the health of domestic trade, contracted 17.5% month-on-month, while automobile fuel consumption, commercial vehicle sales and domestic air passenger traffic all shrank from the preceding month. And the previously relatively unscathed rural economy too saw demand begin to dry up as new infections spread wider and deeper into the countryside, a trend reflected in a 33.5% contraction in the dispatches of two-wheelers and a palpable weakening in demand for tractors. Also, unemployment, which hit a 4-month high of 8% in April as per a survey by the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, was at 9.5% on May 18 based on a 30-day moving average. Crucially, rural unemployment captured by the moving average has risen to 8.6%, and this at a time when the pandemic's grip and higher spending on health are likely to be pushing up precarity among households in the hinterland. Looking ahead, the critical risk to the economy even as it tries to recover from the last fiscal year's crippling contraction is posed by the speed at which the virus continues to spread in the country. With the pace of vaccinations having slowed nationwide, more so in rural and semi-rural areas, the agriculture sector is likely to face challenges in the coming months when sowing for the Kharif crop will need to be done. The reports on the infections and deaths linked to the disease from the villages and towns portray a grim picture, and it is hard to see rural demand for anything other than the barest of essentials including food and medicines reviving anytime soon. Add to this the rising cost of transport fuels, and the sharp increases in commodity prices, cutting across agricultural and industrial raw materials segments, and one sees a worsening of domestic cost conditions as the RBI officials warn. Accelerating inflation threatens the economy's overall consumptive capacity, and policy makers need to be wary of the real danger of stagflation. The shrinking fiscal space notwithstanding, authorities need to spend more on an expedited nationwide vaccine rollout and must seriously consider direct cash transfers to boost demand. Fresh start: the left must guard against the concentration of power in the hands of CM Pinarayi Vijayan. By choosing 17 fresh faces in the new Council of Ministers of 21, the Left Democratic Front, LDF, in Kerala is trying to signal a continuing willingness to evolve as a responsive political organization. Barring Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan, the CPI, M, has not nominated any of its ministers from the previous term. All 4 ministers of the CPI are new. 8 ministers are first-time MLAs, as is the Speaker nominee, MB Rajesh. The composition of the council broadly reflects the state's social diversity, and there are 3 women, the highest in history. The CPI, M, has reconfigured its social base in Kerala, at significant cost to the Congress, and it is reinforcing those trends through the selection of ministers. Veena George and Sajid Cherian are being rewarded for leading a shift of Christian voters in Central Travancore to the party. A judicious mix of youth and experience, the council is an attempt at messaging to the electorate a fresh resolve of the LDF, particularly the CPI, M. But the exclusion of KK Shalja, who has been in the spotlight for her role as health minister, has set off criticism against the CPI, M, from many quarters, including its own support base. After having won with a huge margin, she was expected to provide continuity to the state's fight against the pandemic. Her exclusion does seem like changing horses midstream. KN Balgopal and P. Rajiv have proven their mettle as parliamentarians and in the organization. PA Mohammad Rias happens to be Mr. Vijayan's son-in-law, and R. Bindu the wife of CPI, M, acting State Secretary A. Vijayadavan. Both merit inclusion in their own right. The crowd of 500 expected at the swearing-in ceremony today is, however, bad optics, in the midst of a pandemic which remains untamed in the state that is in lockdown. The new government has more challenges, a cyclone rained misery in the coastal areas this week, and fears of floods loom along with the monsoon clouds. The state's finances are in a shambles. The CPI, M, had replaced 22 sitting MLAs who had finished 2 terms with new candidates in the election. Several senior leaders were already benched by this criterion. The party subsequently decided to nominate only fresh faces to the council by way of reiterating the primacy of the organization over individuals. Ironically, the choices also raise valid concerns of the increasing concentration of power in the hands of Mr. Vijayan. In a council packed with newcomers, the CM will command such authority that an open discussion on any topic could be difficult. Given his complete sway over the party and the government, the onus is on him to empower the ministers. Officials whom he trusted put him and the party in a spot many times during the first term. By restoring political consultations, including within the CPI, M, and keeping the bureaucracy disciplined, Mr. Vijayan could make his second term better than the first. Interpretations which impede a just social order. The Maratha reservation case also shows that divesting states of the power to determine backwardness hits federalism. Suhrit Parthasati. Getty Images Stock Photo. Mitchell Tolira. Getty Images Stock Photo. On May 5, the Supreme Court of India declared as unconstitutional a Maharashtra law which provided for reservation to the Maratha community in education and public employment in the state. 4 judges of the 5-judge bench wrote separate opinions, from which 3 primary findings emanated. First, the court held that the Maratha community did not constitute a socially and educationally backward class. Second, the judges discovered that the law was in breach of a rule previously set by the court disallowing reservations made in excess of 50% of the total available positions. Third, and on this finding, 2 judges on the bench dissented. The court held that state governments had no independent power to declare a group as a backward class. The latter 2 findings run sharply athwart values of equality and federalism, which the court has long regarded, in rhetoric if nothing else, as integral to India's democracy. Not from the constitution. The idea that reservations ought to be restricted to 50% does not stem from the constitution. The text of Articles 16(4) and 15(4), which confer power on the government to make reservations, contains no such limitation. Originally, however, these clauses were seen by the Supreme Court as exceptions to a broad rule of formal equality that was thought to be envisioned by the Constitution. To that end, the court held that to allow reservation in excess of 50% would lead to an exception overriding a rule. But a 7-judge bench, in State of Kerala vs. N.M. Thomas, 1975, laid this theory to rest. There, the court held that a program of reservation was inherent in the Constitution's basic guarantee of equal treatment, and that affirmative action by the state was compelled by an objective of attaining substantive equality. With that, the rule requiring that reservations stay under 50% ought to have been deemed incongruous. But when the court sat as a 9-judge bench in Indra Sawhney vs. Union of India, 1992, it sustained a paradox. The majority on the bench ruled, on the one hand, that N.M. Thomas was correct in seeing reservations as embedded in a constitutional vision of substantive equality, and, on the other hand, that reservation made in excess of 50%, barring exceptional circumstances, was harmful to that very vision. As the lawyer Gautam Bhatia has pointed out, this is an incompatible position. Yet, efforts to have the verdict in Indra Sawhney reconsidered have failed. The upshot, a mathematical formula with no basis in the Constitution's text, is retained, even as the court pays symbolic obeisance to the ideals of substantive equality. Courts stand on listings. These limitations are made worse by the court's present ruling on the power of state governments to declare groups as backward. Until now, the central government and each of the state governments produced separate lists declaring communities as socially and educationally backward. Following the Supreme Court's judgment in Indra Sawhney, the determination of backward classes was made by the National Commission for the Backward Classes, at the level of the centre, and by regional commissions at the level of the state governments. As a result, backward communities that were kept out of the central list were entitled to reservation at least for those posts and seats under the control of the state government. For example, 25 different groups categorized as backward in Tamil Nadu do not find place in the central list. https://bit.ly/306x7c. This division in power, which gave states autonomy to classify groups as backward, stood in contrast to the lists of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In the case of those lists, right from the Constitution's inception, the power to prepare them vested solely with the Union government. But the Supreme Court has now held that this distinction no longer holds good. The 102nd Amendment, 2018, which forms the basis for the court's ruling, granted constitutional status to the National Commission for Backward Classes. In addition, it introduced Article 342 through which it stipulated that the President of India may, after consultation with the state government, notify groups of persons within such a state who are deemed to be socially and educationally backward. Any such central list, the clause clarified, could only be altered by Parliament. Article 366(26)(c) was also added, and socially and educationally backward classes was defined as such backward classes as are so deemed under Article 342 for the purposes of this Constitution. Term and interpretations. In interpreting these changes, a majority on the bench concluded that the Constitution had now created a structure for determination of other backward classes identical to that in place for the preparation of the lists of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The verdict, which was controlled predominantly by Justice S. Ravindra Bhatt's opinion, relied on the plain meaning of Articles 342A and 366(26)(c). But it overlooked, at least, two essential factors. First, the term central list, which is used in Article 342A, has always been understood in contradistinction to the term state list, in that it refers to the categorization of groups as backward for the purposes of reservation to posts and seats under the Union government's control. Second, when state governments objected to the 102nd Amendment on the ground that their power was being divested, the Union Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment, Thawarchand Gehlot, assuaged their concerns and pointed out that the proposed changes did no such thing. The right to include or remove in the state's list will remain as it is and it will not be violated in any manner, he said in Parliament. It is an acceptable proposition of constitutional interpretation to hold that external aids, such as parliamentary debates, are useful only when the plain meaning of a provision is unclear. However, here, the term central list, in Article 342A, unlike Articles 341 and 342, which concern the preparation of a list of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes respectively, shows that, if anything, The Constitution recognizes the power of state government to frame lists of their own. Any other interpretation of the term, central list, would only impinge on the plain meaning of the term. On the other hand, if one were to concede that two interpretations to the amendments were plausible, then one would have thought that the court would have adopted the interpretation that allows for a more equitable division of power between the central and state governments. If the majority's interpretation of the 102nd Amendment is correct, then the changes altogether disposes states from exercising a time-honored authority. But yet the amendment, in the court's belief, did not violate the Constitution's basic structure. This was because, according to the majority, the alterations neither took away the very essence of federalism, nor denuded the states of their effective power to legislate. But it is hard to see how divesting states of a power this critical, to classify groups as backward, entitling many communities to protection under Articles 15(4) and 16(4), can be seen as anything but offensive to the essence of federalism. The changes, as interpreted by the court, are by no means superficial. They directly impede the ability of states to secure a just social order. The Union government has already filed a petition to review the judgment insofar as it limits the power of state governments. Should the court refuse the plea, it is imperative that Parliament amends the Constitution and grants to states an express power to determine backwardness. Any other result will offend the delicate balance at the heart of Indian federalism. Suhrit Parthasarthi is an advocate practicing at the Madras High Court. A collage of laws that leaves the worker out in the cold. The universalization of social security remains an unfulfilled aspiration in the new Code on Social Security. Santosh Malhotra and Kingshuk Sarkar. Sandeep Saxena Sandeep Saxena. As COVID-19 destroys lives and livelihoods, an unprepared government has rendered low-paid, informal workers, who constitute 91% of the workforce, totally hapless, pushing them further into poverty. Imagine if these same informal workers had social security, including free basic curative care in public clinics and hospitals, the elderly had old age pensions, the dying had death disability insurance or life insurance. Imagine also that they had at least a minimum income guarantee, which prevented them from falling into debt. Debt is currently exploding among the poor as their incomes collapsed. Gaps in the code. India's Parliament in September 2020 passed a Social Security Code, SS Code 2020, https://bit.ly/320f . Does this law even attempt to provide these, let alone guarantee them? That is what we examine here. We shall set aside the issue of free basic curative health care, since the SS Code does not have that in its scope. Fair enough. But has the government of India ensured that at least in a year of a nationwide pandemic, the health budget for FY 2021-22 is higher than the pathetic just over 1% of GDP that it has been for decades, making all past central state governments complicit? If we leave out the allocation for the COVID-19 vaccine, still mostly unused, then the floor FY22 health budget is actually lower. The SS Code 2020 merges existing social security laws and attempts to include informal workers within the ambit of Social Security Administration. However, an examination of the code reveals that universalization of social security remains an unfulfilled aspiration. The SS Code 2020 amalgamates and rationalizes the provisions of 8 existing central labor laws. Of these acts, Employees' Provident Fund, Employees' State Insurance, ESI, Maternity Benefit, Gratuity are entirely for organized sector workers. This has remained so even in the new scheme of things. For Employees' State Insurance, the existing employee threshold has been withdrawn and now the central government can extend ESI benefits to any organization irrespective of the number of workers employed therein. However, there are areas of ambiguity and overlapping too. Hurdles for informal workers. However, is the code going to provide universal social security to the 91% workers in the informal sector? It proposes that both the central and state governments will formulate schemes for unorganized workers. The legal framework as proposed in the code and rules implies that the basic onus lies on informal workers registering as beneficiaries. Registration is a prerequisite for universal coverage. To avail Social Security, an informal worker must register herself on the specified online portal to be developed by the central government. Similar provisions are already there in existing Social Security schemes run by state governments under the Unorganized Workers' Social Security Act, 2008. Still, a large number of informal workers are outside the ambit of any Social Security even after 13 years. The absence of definite and unambiguous provisions in the present code would further complicate achievement of universal registration. Also, experience shows that there is an awful lack of awareness among informal workers regarding Social Security schemes. Online registration places a further challenge as most informal workers lack digital literacy and connectivity, already demonstrated by a similar registration requirement for COVID-19 vaccines under CodeWIN, the government app. Informal workers also find it difficult to furnish all documentary papers required as part of the registration process. Most informal workers are footloose casual workers, 26% of all workers, and self-employed, 46% of all. They move from one place to another in search of livelihoods. Furnishing proof of livelihood and income details in the absence of tangible employer-employee relations is very difficult. Such requirements deter informal workers from completing the registration and they continue to remain outside the Social Security ambit. Interstate cooperation must. Further, as unorganized workers are spread across the length and breadth of India, interstate arrangement and cooperation becomes imperative. The code does not provide for such eventualities. Ideally, the central government should conceptualize a basic structure, which if successful, should be adopted by states after necessary customization. Without such a basic structure, implications of this code would be too varied across states to be administered. Providing holistic Social Security cover for the unorganized workforce in a simple and effective manner is something lost in the center-state labyrinth and jurisdictional or institutional overlap. The unorganized workforce is all-encompassing, minus the minuscule regular workers of organized sectors. This identity should be primal and all unorganized workers should have basic Social Security coverage, irrespective of labor market classifications. The code fails to undertake such inclusion in a meaningful way. Key benefits. Maternity benefit. Under the SS code, the provision of maternity benefit has not been made universal. Maternity benefit is presently applicable for establishments employing 10 workers or more. The definition of establishment in the proposed code did not include the unorganized sector. Hence, women engaged in the unorganized sector would remain outside the purview of maternity benefit. This obsession with thresholds of the number of workers employed was the bane of earlier labor laws too. Employees Provident Fund. The SS code maintains that the Employees Provident Fund scheme will remain applicable, as before, to every establishment in which 20 or more employees are employed. Thus, for informal sector workers, access to Employees Provident Fund remains unfulfilled too in the new code. Payment of gratuity. Gratuity shall be payable to eligible employees by every shop or establishment in which 10 or more employees are employed, or were employed, on any day of the preceding 12 months. But although payment of gratuity was expanded in the new code, it still remains inaccessible for a vast majority of informal workers. Lost opportunity. The provision of Social Security could be used to formalize the workforce to a certain extent. Employers could have been made to own up to the responsibility of providing Social Security to their workers. The state has a responsibility, but the primary responsibility still lies with employers since they are taking advantage of workers' productivity. Financial constraints are there for the state too, but all the code does is to state that it will design schemes for informal workers as and when it deems fit. In the end, this code remains a collage of existing pieces of legislation without that interweaving thread of integration. It has promise but cannot meet those expectations. At a time when India chairs a BRICS meeting in Delhi, preparatory to a summit that is focused on issues of labor, especially informality, it fails to even recognize that India is aging without Social Security, and the demographic dividend of the young workforce that could support the aging ends in 15 years. This is a dreadful failure on the part of the state in a time of dire crisis for the nation. Santosh Malhotra is the editor of Reviving Jobs, An Agenda for Growth, 2020, and visiting professor, Centre for Development, University of Bath, UK. Kingshuk Sarkar is an independent researcher and labour administrator with the government of West Bengal. Thank you. Editorial 2. The basics of an effective vaccine policy: prioritizing groups, addressing hesitancy and rethinking the distribution plan is the way forward. A huge undertaking, people waiting in queue to get a shot of COVID-19 vaccine in Bangalore on Wednesday. AP. George Thomas Gagandeep Khan Jaya Prakash Molil. Over a year after the SARS-CoV-2 struck the world, it is now clear that the virus is not going away anytime soon, and breaking the chain of transmission seems unlikely. The best policy against COVID-19, thus, appears to be to ensure that the infection is mild in most people, and that in those in whom the disease might be more severe, it can be pushed towards a milder form by vaccination. Therefore, it is important to vaccinate as many people as possible. Unfortunately, the number of vaccine doses available is limited at present. Technicalities of vaccine production make it likely that indigenous manufacturers will require 3 to 6 months from now to increase capacity significantly. The whole variant vaccine from the National Institute of Virology, Pune, currently being manufactured by Bharat Biotech, is produced in facilities where biological safety requirements are essential and will take time to be upscaled. The mRNA vaccine technology is new. Though the Moderna vaccine does not have intellectual property constraints, and Genova is making its own mRNA vaccine based on science from HDT in the United States, it is unrealistic to expect Indian manufacturers to be able to embrace this new technology without hand-holding through the process. Difficult choices. Import of vaccines in quantities that can make a difference will be possible perhaps from August, when wealthy nations would have made substantial progress in the immunization of their populations. India is thus faced with the unpleasant reality of having to decide the priority in which it is going to vaccinate its population, i.e., the order in which the different groups should be vaccinated. However, it can take comfort in the fact that all countries were forced to make this decision, and nowhere in the world has it been possible to vaccinate the entire population at one go. The experience of vaccine hesitancy should not distract us from the goal of inoculating as many people as quickly as possible. The speed with which the vaccines were developed, the introduction of new technology, reports of a few serious adverse events, the decision of certain wealthy countries to halt using the AstraZeneca shot due to concerns over blood clots and because they had other vaccines, contributed to doubts about the safety of vaccines in India. But it is now clear that vaccines are highly effective and the risks are extremely low. Indeed, vaccines are the only way that we can stay ahead of the virus. It is, hence, important to draw in behavioral scientists to address vaccine hesitancy and ensure that the population is covered. Careful planning. Should we vaccinate the most vulnerable, i.e., those who are most likely to succumb to the disease if they get infected, or should we vaccinate the population which contributes the most to the economy? This is a stark and perhaps unpalatable way to delineate the choice, but it is a factual position. Should we first vaccinate the elderly who are at high risk of serious illness and death, or should we vaccinate the working population so that we can open workplaces and revive the economy? Wealthy countries with small populations went with the first option, but India must design a vaccine policy carefully because breaking the chain of transmission is not an option currently. Repeated lockdowns do not break the chain of transmission of the infection. They only slow the spread of the virus for a period, and when they are lifted, as they must be, the virus surfaces again. Transparent decision making. The ethical and humane choice would be to vaccinate the most vulnerable first. If this is impractical, then the choice would be to vaccinate some combination of the elderly vulnerable and the working population in every tranche. This should be worked out using data, and the basis of the decision should be made public. Opaque decision-making leads to a loss of trust in governance and social discord. Access to all. Leaving the vaccination policy to market forces is neither ethical nor practical. Allowing all adults to access the vaccine at the same time introduces ethical distortions, which no humane society should face. Those with the resources to get vaccinated early are the least vulnerable because they also have the ability to protect themselves. Attempts to make vaccination more accessible through technology, as is being done with the CoWIN app, are failing at the moment. Many states have declared that they will bear the cost for all their citizens, but this is a decision that they should not have been forced to make. The approach also does not address the dilemma of who will get the vaccine and in which order, given the very limited supply. Governments are elected to represent the will of the people. In a civilized society, when a life-saving resource is in short supply, the government must take it upon itself to both enhance the supply and formulate a policy to allocate the resource. In India, the centre should desist from being opaque in its decisions, abdicating its responsibility, transferring expenses to state governments, and allowing market forces to decide on vaccine access for a substantial part of the population. Given our current circumstances, the state governments are struggling to find the way forward amid the scramble for vaccines. There are many options for distribution, and as a society, we ought to make decisions that are based on science and fairness. The logical basis of the decision should be explained. Dr. George Thomas is the former editor of the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics. Dr. Gagandeep Khan is Professor Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory at the Christian Medical College, Vellore. Dr. Jaya Prakash Moliyil is former principal of the Christian Medical College, Vellore. A thaw in India-Pakistan trade relations, latest data give a reason to push for revival of dialogue. The rejection by the Pakistan government of the recent proposal made to it by the Economic Coordination Committee, ECC, to import sugar, cotton and cotton yarn from India was disappointing, but at the same time indicative of a possibility of resumption of trade relations between the two countries. In 2019, India and Pakistan undertook trade restrictive measures against each other, which were perhaps the most severe in several decades. After the Pulwama terror attack in Kashmir in February 2019 and cross-border airstrikes, India withdrew the most favored nation, MFN, status of Pakistan and imposed a customs duty hike of 200% on imports. Later, when India revoked the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan suspended bilateral trade. Despite the trade ban setback, the Indo-Pak history suggests that there are reasons for having cautious optimism towards reviving the trade dialogue. Even though trade curbs have been applied several times in the past, such measures have been reversed to create a trade-enhancing environment. Most notable is the Protocol on Resumption of Trade in 1974 after a hiatus of 9 years following the India-Pakistan War in 1965. The two countries agreed to trade in a list of items, including essential agricultural commodities, which could stabilize domestic prices and take care of seasonal shortages and food security in the home country. Both countries worked on positive lists for some years, which expanded over the years. We can see parallels emerging in the current context. Within a month of suspending bilateral trade with India, the Pakistan government lifted the ban on the import of medicines and raw material from India to avert any crisis and ensure that there is no shortage of essential drugs. A year and a half later, there is a demand for the inclusion of 3 more items, namely sugar, cotton and yarn. A deeper examination of the trade measures and data indicate that there is more concrete evidence of trade between the two countries even after the imposition of restrictions. A key difference between India and Pakistan is that while India imposed a 200% import duty and no ban on export, Pakistan banned both export and import. Hence, Indian trade data are likely to reflect trends better. Not only has trade been recorded in the first 11 months of the financial year 2020-21, but a sizable number of items have been traded between the two countries. During 2020-21, April to February, the recorded bilateral trade was $280 million, of which India's exports to Pakistan were $278 million and imports were $2 million. Nearly 77% of India's exports comprised vaccines, pharmaceutical products and products of chemical and allied industries. Interestingly, despite the trade ban, sugar was already being exported to Pakistan and was the second most important item, accounting for 15% of India's total exports. Dates were the most important item being imported from Pakistan, accounting for 31% of total imports, followed by ethyl alcohol, which accounted for 17% of total imports. Significant costs. While the overall value of trade with Pakistan may not be significant, the number of items traded certainly is. A closer look at the trade data reveals that India exported 357 products, at H's 6-digit level classification, to Pakistan and imported 25 products from the country. This is despite the complete ban on trade by Pakistan on both exports and imports. Thus, even under restrictive trade conditions, there are interdependencies between India and Pakistan. The trade measures impacted several important domestic and export industries, even though the volume of trade was small at $2.56 billion in 2018-19. Governments of both countries need to recognize that there are significant costs of non-cooperation. Restrictions also shift trade to informal channels, which have functioned for decades and are a ready option for traders from both countries. Initiating a positive list for trade is the right move towards normalization. The recent data provide an indicative list of products that can be included. Business organizations and chambers of commerce can play an important role in creating a strong lobby that could build momentum in opening channels and influence the shaping of the India-Pakistan trade policy. Nisha Taneja is professor at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi. Samridhi Bimal is an independent consultant. Overstepping the norm, the centre's blanket decision to provide security cover to 77 MLAs raises a slew of questions. MP Natnail. The recent order by the Union Ministry of Home Affairs, MHA, for providing security cover to 77 MLAs of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, who were elected earlier this month after the West Bengal Assembly poll is not only unprecedented but appears politically motivated. It is rare for such a blanket order for deployment of forces to protect individuals to be issued. While 16 of these MLAs already have security cover of different levels, 61 of them will now be under the X category umbrella. In practice, decisions to provide security to persons under threat is taken by a committee in the MHA, which comprises officials from the Ministry, the Intelligence Bureau, Delhi Police and senior officials of the Central Armed Police Forces, that is, the Central Reserve Police Force, CRPF, the Central Industrial Security Force, CISF, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITBP, and the National Security Guard, NSG. While the Intelligence Bureau prepares the list of persons under threat and the degree of threat, the committee decides on the force to be deployed depending upon the place where the person is located. The deployment is done after the recommendations of the committee are approved by the competent authority. In these meetings, the threat perception of each of the person to be secured is discussed one by one and not collectively for any group as such. A state subject. That the decision to deploy CAF personnel for the 77 MLAs might have stemmed from political motivation can be inferred from the fact that the threat perception for each of the persons was not discussed. In the past, such deployment of central forces for the protection of individuals was done in Punjab and in Jammu and Kashmir, when these regions were rocked by unrest. Since militants tried to sabotage the process of elections, poll candidates were generally targeted. The central government, therefore, took blanket decisions to provide security to every candidate till the elections got over. Law and order being a state subject, West Bengal is duty-bound to protect every citizen of the state, more so the MLAs. In the absence of the central government's decision to deploy CAPFs, the West Bengal government should have shouldered the responsibility. But by deploying central forces, the centre has sent a clear signal that it does not rely upon the state government to provide foolproof security to the BJP MLAs. This is hardly a healthy sign for centre-state relations. The central government's distrust of officers who are considered close to a state's ruling dispensation does not bode well for police officers across the country. On the state governments devolves the onerous responsibility of maintaining law and order at all costs, and it is their sacred duty to protect every MLA, irrespective of political affiliation. The number of protected persons has increased in recent years to such an extent that in 2019, as many as 66,043 police and CAP personnel were deployed to protect 19,467 ministers, members of parliament, judges and bureaucrats, against the sanctioned strength of 43,556 personnel, as per the data on police organizations. The Prime Minister has a strength of over 3,000 CAP personnel on deputation to Special Protection Group, SPG, under the SPG Act, protecting him round the clock. Constant deployment of CAP personnel on protection duties impacts their training schedule. After the initial 8-week training for VIP protection, the personnel have to undergo a 2-week refresher training periodically to hone their skills. To curb the tendency of demanding security personnel around themselves, leaders and prominent persons should be asked to bear the expenditure, as is being done for an industrialist who pays 16 rupees lakh per month for the security cover provided to him. Similarly, members of parliament and leaders with criminal records should be charged a fee for the security personnel deployed to protect them. Having security cover has now become a status symbol, and the growing clamor by people for personnel to escort them will be curbed to a large extent if they are made to pay for the security. MP Natnail is a retired Inspector General of Police, CRPF. 50 years ago, 20th May 1971, cutting group premium insurance. Chandigarh, May 19th. The Life Insurance Corporation has decided to reduce the premium on group insurance by 25 to 30% from June 1st this year, its chairman, Mr. T.A. Pai, told a news conference here today. He said the idea was to make group insurance as attractive as possible. But he made it clear that premium on individual life policies would not be lowered. Mr. Pai said the LIC was also studying the possibility of introducing a group war risk insurance scheme for the defense forces. The scheme would cover personnel of the 3 arms of the defense forces, the Army, Air Force and Navy. The government would have to underwrite the scheme, he said. Cover for substandard lives. Mr. Pai also said he was suggesting to the government to create a development fund for LIC to undertake insurance of substandard lives. He said it was a social obligation of the state, of which LIC was an instrument, to insure people who were classified as risks in insurance parlance. Thank you. Other important news. PM Cares must disclose details of COVID-19 care. Plea in SC on lapses in management. Legal correspondent, New Delhi. A plea has been filed in the Supreme Court to direct the Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance and Relief in Emergency Situations Fund, PM Cares Fund, to disclose the money it has allocated so far for COVID-19 care. Activist Saket Gokhale said PM Cares should produce details of its mechanism to monitor the progress of the various projects it had allocated money for. Important stakeholder. Mr. Gokhale urged the court to make PM Cares a party in its suo motu case on COVID-19 management and lapses. The application said the fund has been, since the first national lockdown, an important stakeholder in the procurement and funding of essential supplies and services for the COVID-19 pandemic. The PM Cares Fund, according to the press release announcing its constitution, was set up primarily keeping in mind the current COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Gokhale pointed out. Since its inception, the PM Cares Fund has collected monetary contributions from India as well as overseas, which includes salary contributions by employees and members of several Government of India ministries and PSUs, he said. The application listed a series of announcements said to be made by the fund, including an allocation on May 13 last year of ₹3,000 crore for COVID-19, of which 2,000 rupees crore will be earmarked for the purchase of ventilators, 1,000 rupees crore for care of migrant laborers and 100 rupees crore to support vaccine development. BJP raising fake toolkit issue to divert attention, trying to divert from its failures, com. Special correspondent, New Delhi. The Congress on Wednesday accused the BJP of trying to raise a fake toolkit issue to divert attention from the failures of the Narendra Modi government in handling the second wave of COVID-19. It claimed that the basic data of a document related to the Central Vista project was forged as the Congress toolkit on COVID-19. Addressing an online press conference, Randeep Surjewala, the party's chief spokesperson, rubbished BJP spokesperson Sambit Patra's claim that metadata, data containing basic information such as author, creation date, file size, had clearly proven that a person working in the All India Congress Committee, AICC, research department was behind the controversial document that called for destroying the Prime Minister's image. The apparent forgery and its use to divert agenda and agenda setting has been exposed. I understand that Dr. Sambit Patra will have to go to jail and he is jittery because of that. And this metadata nonsense that he is doing. We clearly said yesterday that the Central Vista document is our document, Mr. Surjewala said, adding that the metadata of a real document cannot be used to justify a forged document. On Tuesday, the Congress party had filed an email complaint with the Delhi police naming BJP President JP Nadda, Union Minister Smriti Irani, Mr. Patra and party organizing secretary BL Santish for sharing a forged and fake document on social media platforms. Rajasthan Gov declares mucormycosis an epidemic. State has more than 100 black fungus disease patients on watch. Once a disease is declared notifiable, it is mandatory for hospitals to report every case. G. Ramakrishna, Special Correspondent, Jaipur. Amid the increasing instances of mucormycosis or black fungus, which is primarily affecting people recovering from COVID-19, the Rajasthan government on Wednesday declared it an epidemic and a notifiable disease. It will be mandatory for the health facilities to report every case of the disease in the state. The state has at present more than 100 black fungus patients, for whom a special ward has been established at the Savai Mansingh Government Hospital here. More of these cases are being reported from Jaipur, Jodhpur, Sirohi and Kota districts. Principal Health Secretary Akhil Arora said the declaration of mucormycosis as an epidemic would ensure its integrated and coordinated treatment along with the treatment for COVID-19. The notification was issued under the Rajasthan Epidemic Act, 2020. Mucormycosis appears as a side effect among COVID-19 patients who are put on oxygen support through liquid medical oxygen cylinders or oxygen concentrators. The state government has also given instructions for procurement of oxygen concentrators of good quality and ensure strict compliance with safety measures while using them. Thank you. Faith. Lord Krishna's Leela. Devaki was the daughter of Devaka. Devaka was the younger brother of King Ugrasena, and Kamsa was the son of the latter. Kamsa was very fond of his cousin Devaki, and when Devaki married Vasudeva, Kamsa decided to drive them in the royal chariot to their palace. But as the chariot was on the way to Vasudeva's palace, a voice was heard that warned that the eighth child of Devaki would kill Kamsa. Why did the Lord arrange for such an announcement to be made? When he took the Rama Avatra, Ravana had no warning of what was in store for him. Old poet Kalidasa gives a hint. Kalidasa says that the moment Rama was born in Ayodhya, Ravana's crown dropped from his head. But even Kalidasa says nothing of any explicit warning to Ravana. The Krishna Avatra was exceptional in this sense, said V.S. Karunkaracharya, in a discourse. Even before Krishna was born, what he was going to do was spoken about. Was this not a Leela of Krishna? To be killed suddenly is far preferable to knowing that danger awaits, but not knowing when it will strike. Kamsa had to undergo the torment of not knowing when and how Krishna was going to kill him. Krishna wanted to show the world that he who rejected him and hated him would suffer the agony of Kamsa. Killing Kamsa was no big deal for Krishna, for Kamsa was not such a great opponent. Ravana was the recipient of many boons. Hiranyakashipu was mighty, and Madhu and Kaitva were all strong. And the Lord had destroyed them all. Comparatively, Kamsa was not a difficult person to vanquish. Kurathavan points this out. And yet, why do we celebrate every deed of Krishna the way we do? It is because of Krishna's style of